Welcome back to another episode of Broke Up, Not Broken. If you're going through a divorce, don't worry, you're not alone. This is your one-stop shop for mastering your life and your finances throughout the entire divorce process. Today, I'm super excited to have Alex Love with us. Alex has over 15 years of marketing and communications experience across both private and public sectors. She's currently the VP of Marketing and Communications at RIVA Solutions. Did I say that right?
You did?
Awesome. As an IT government contractor, she's an entrepreneur at heart and co-founded Digital District in 2013, which is a 501c6 organization aimed at fostering innovation and education in the digital sphere. Personally, and this is awesome, Alex is an avid power lifter. She could probably kick my butt. New mom and podcast host. Her podcast, Mastering the Art of Failing, which I've listened to a couple episodes, is amazing, discusses the positive aspects of failure, highlighting the unique stories of entrepreneurs and business people who have turned failures into successful pivots, shaping the individuals that they are today. Probably in a lot of incidences like divorce, right? So listen, if you're feeling overwhelmed by your divorce or your current station in life, please don't be. Alex is here to help us break it down so you can feel confident and prepared by creating a clearer picture of not only your financial situation, but how you can tackle some of the personal challenges that you might be facing as well. So grab a cup of coffee or your beverage of choice, buckle up, and let's get you once again personally and financially empowered. Alex, it's amazing to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so we were talking on a lead up here that we have both gone through a divorce in our lives. So tell me a little bit more about what that experience was like and how you overcame it and got to be where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been 5 years, I think, since I separated from my ex-husband and 4 since the divorce went through. So thankfully, I made that decision in 2019 before the pandemic shut everything down, and we were in divorce court in January 2020. So thank you to my past self for making that choice in 2019, because 2020 would have looked a lot different had I not made that decision. But yeah, I went to college in Boston. I always knew I wanted to move to Washington, D.C., and so I moved to D.C. directly after finishing college. I'd interned in D.C., so I had some friends here, and it just kind of felt like a good place to be. And before I got to D.C., I always thought politics was my path. And then I got into some of that and realized I hated absolutely every single second of it. But I still really loved Washington, D.C. So I was like, screw it, we'll move, we'll make it work, we'll figure it out. So I'd met my ex literally right after moving down to DC. He was a little bit more established, a couple years older, working in politics. So there are still some of those pieces of my life that I had, as a younger self kind of envisioned. And so we ended up getting married a couple of years later, and then really looking down on my 30th birthday, realized how unhappy that I was. And there was really nothing significant that had happened in our relationship. We had just really sort of not been a good fit, I think, from day one. But your 22-year-old self and your 30-year-old self, obviously, there's been some growth there. And I think I had kind of, done a lot of things in my life that I wanted to do. I went back and got my MBA. I started a business. I had a lot of successes and I was checking off those boxes. And the closer I got to 30, the more I was like, hey, I really want to be a mom. I really want to have kids. This is not my partner. This is kind of like a child, and I was like, I don't want to be one of those people that thinks having children is gonna fix our relationship, because that's just not the case, right? This is just gonna end up being me with, taking care of even more people and then sort of ending up in this single mom situation, right? So right before my 30th birthday, we kind of sat down and I said, this is not working. We're not a good match. I don't think this has, legs. We should really think about kind of taking a different path and starting the separation period, moving out, and, ultimately getting divorced. And so difficult to have that conversation. Yeah. I kind of had to pep myself up for it. I think in my brain, there'd been a couple of months that I was like, I know I need to rip off this Band-Aid and start this conversation with my ex-husband. And I think we actually went to Atlanta for a wedding, and it was just the worst possible vacation trip together. We spent the entire thing apart, and I was like, this is it, right? And the driving factor actually to have the conversation, which is more financial based, was that the lease on our our house was coming up for renewal. And we had to give 60 days notice. And I was like, I cannot do another 2 years. This is crazy. So it really kind of was that finance piece that kind of pushed me, I think, to make that final decision that was like, hey, we need to kind of cut this and move on right now.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing story. So, and was it amicable, or was it a struggle? What did that look like?
Yes, I think every single day was sort of a different journey. And I think being the person who asked for the divorce, I had processed the situation, I think, more. And so, the initial conversation went fairly well. I was actually surprised, and he kind of agreed. We really truly have kind of become roommates and are mostly living separate lives. And sort of, he was kind of on the fence about having kids and was, can we wait? And I'm like, time's ticking, right? Like I'm on a timetable given age. So it's really not something that I'm really interested in doing, because there's no guarantee that just because we get divorced that I'm going to meet the right next person, right? I have to rebuild another relationship and find the right spouse if, I really do truly want to have kids. So that conversation went better than I expected. And then in the, I say, month and a half that we still occupied the space together before I moved out and then he ultimately moved out, was pretty tumultuous. He definitely went through all of the grief stages where one day it was okay. One day he was really angry. Sometimes he was sad. He got really kind of crazy towards the end. And I was living in the gym, to be honest, at that point in my life, because I had a really great support system and really great friends. So I was kind of doing everything that I could to sort of not physically be in that space, just because I didn't know what I was going to walk into. But towards the end, we had some really weird allegations made against me. I was cheating on him. I was in a cult, which, to be fair, I was doing CrossFit at the time. So maybe that was his orientation. And he was, pegging my gym friends as sort of the problem, right? So not in a cult, not cheating. And I had also was going through physical therapy for a lifting injury. So I had actually torn the cartilage in my wrist, and I not really good at giving up the gym, right? So I kind of worked out through a lot of that injury. And at some point, my physical therapist was like, hey, I can't do anything else for you if you're not going to stop lifting. So go see a specialist. And I got a cortisone shot, which, to be fair, is steroids, but not quite the steroids that, he was throwing in my direction. So got really wild at the end. And now looking back on it, I kind of laugh about a lot of these things that happened. But in the moment, probably not a great year for me.
Yeah. Is this what propelled you into CrossFit, or were you already doing CrossFit and this just accelerated your passion for it? Were you already doing this before you were divorced?
Yeah, I was already doing CrossFit. I was one of those people who didn't grow up athletic. I was more on the music sort of art side, and found the gym kind of as an adult and realized hey, this is really, really good for probably mostly stress and mental, right? And then I really like a challenge. I'm a very competitive person. So naturally kind of found myself in the CrossFit gym because it's a very high intense, really cool community. And I made a ton of friends there. And so I think that, box that I was working out in those gym friends at the time were probably one of the things that did cause me to realize I'm not sharing this part of my life with my spouse. And I don't even really want to invite him out when we go out, he's kind of like someone I don't want to be around. So yeah, that was definitely one of the saving graces, I think, from that year, was having that community and having that outlet while my personal life was sort of in flux.
Got it. What influenced you to start the podcast?
So ironically enough, my podcast co-host is also divorced, and we both kind of handled our divorce. He's a couple of years ahead of me in terms of his divorce, but he had moved out of the DC area down back home because, again, he wanted to have children, and, that ultimately didn't end up working out with his ex-wife. So while he was going through that process, and because he had just moved, he was like, hey, everyone, I really want to start training for a half marathon. Is anybody in? And I said, sure, why not? That sounds like a cool challenge. So a group of us, started doing the training, and we picked a location that was central to all of us at the time, which unfortunately for me was Asheville, North Carolina, which I had never been to. And it's a mountain. And DC is flat. So when I got there to run the half marathon, which I crawled my way through essentially, I think I was in for a big shock. But it was cool to come together and do that with him and some of our groups of friends, because that was his outlet. And, he's continued with that. Now he's doing like Ironmans, 100-milers, that kind of thing. I have retired from the long distance, endurance sports and really focused on my passion for CrossFit. But that's part of what kind of brought us together. He's also my business partner from when we stood up Digital District, which is one of those things that I hold in my life as probably one of my biggest personal successes and failures, because the business ultimately didn't do what we wanted it to do. So again, because our lives are sort of parallel, he had his first child a couple of months before I had mine. And so what else do you do when you're, welcoming children and pregnant besides start a podcast together? So that's kind of what brought us back together. And we're sort of living these tangential lives, a couple of years apart.
Amazing. So this is a financial show, right? We want to try to provide as much financial advice as we can along the way. We don't want to spend all our time talking about it. But one of the things that we see happen with a lot of the clients that we work with and people that listen to the show and people that are in our Facebook group and so on is the feeling like they failed in their marriage, right? The divorce is a failure. They're failing they failed at their marriage, and now the stress of the marriage and the concerns they have over finances are now putting them in a position where they feel like they're a failure at work. And it's this failure syndrome in many ways. And I think we all have gone through that experience in some respects, regardless of how things started off or how things ended up. I think we've all walked down that path in some way. So how do you apply the principles that you have in the work that you do and the stories you tell on the podcast to help people recognize, like, listen, like this is not the end of this is not the end, right? This is in many ways the new beginning, and to rebuild their personal and their financial lives.
Yeah, I think that's kind of how I orient my life, is that everything is a season. And again, being a new mom, like the newborn season was a season, right? Like everything, you've survived everything. And this is just a season of your life and a phase of your life that you ultimately will get through. So, financially, when we were starting to talk about separating, we weren't in a good spot. I was the primary breadwinner. My ex had been laid off multiple times during our relationship, which was also, I think, part of, in my brain, you're not a stable sort of provider. So I was, carrying forward a lot of the bills, and DC's not a cheap place to live. We weren't able to ever buy a place, right? We were continuing to rent and, rack up credit card bills because we wanted to go to this place to eat dinner and sort of do these social activities. So, not a great place for us to be financially. And that was another thing that I had to really step back and sort of take a look at, was like, can I do this on my own? And while I was making, a lion's share of our net salaries together, he still was contributing. And so I had to sit there, before I made this decision and go through the budget and was like, what can I actually afford as a single person? Because I've got a dog that has, she's a very large pit bull. I can't just take her anywhere, right? She's got to be in a specific situation. Not all landlords are going to welcome a dog like that. DC is a very expensive place to be. Can I even afford this? I've still got a car loan. I got student loan debts. I've got all of these things that I sort of need to keep track of. And so I had to sit down and do the math and say, like, what can I actually afford? And when it came out to the doing it, I was like, okay, I can make this work. It's going to be painful. And part of what was in our divorce agreement was taking this like massive credit card bill that we had amassed over, our 4 or 5 years married, and splitting that down the middle. And to be able to sort of consolidate all those cards, we ended up taking out those like, slightly predatory loans, very high interest, 20% lending tree, whatever it is kind of stuff, because we didn't have a house. We didn't have any equity that we could, go to a bank and say, we sort of need these loans to be able to equal everyone's, payments out and then sort of respectively pay off our half as individuals. So yeah, factoring that in was hard because that's, $1,000, I think, a month that I had to put into paying that back. And it was like 30 grand. That was my half. Yeah. So taking that plus like actual expenses, having a place by myself, it was a very, very expensive move. And I didn't want to move out of DC because that's, that I worked downtown. That's sort of where my friends were, it's where my support system was. And it was the first time I think I'd ever lived by myself, which I was fine with. The transition, I think, was fine, but it was just a very hefty financial period. And I knew that, I had to sort of orient my life to like, how do I get this paid down and be able to keep up with everything else, to still live the life that I would like to live as a single individual, but be, financially responsible for all of these decisions that we had made in the past.
Man, that is so many of our listeners and frankly, a lot of the clients that we work with are in the same shoes. And they inherit debt that they've racked up through the course of the marriage, and now it's another mountain they have to climb, another mountain they have to scale in order to work to get over it so they can move on with the next phase of their life. It's incredible. So I think, the message here for listeners is, number one, from a financial planning perspective, I am a certified financial planner. So I always, when people start talking about like predatory lending and, these payday advance places, like the hair on the back of my neck goes up. So you want to try to avoid those at all costs, but I recognize that that's not always the case. So whatever you can do to try to, figure out how to get over that hump and not, just kill yourself from an interest rate perspective, that's ideally the situation. And I think the other thing that you talked about and the way that you kind of frame this for yourself is, I need to figure out what my future life is going to look like from an expense perspective, right? Like, so many of the people, and I actually just did a video on this a couple of days ago, and we put this on social media and everything else, where it's like so many people make the mistake as they're filling out their financial forms for their attorney, or they're trying to do it on their own. They're like, well, my current, rent payment is, $1,500 a month, and my car payment is this, and this is what it costs to put the kids in daycare, and so on and so forth. Well, that's fine. But what you're trying to do is in your situation, you're trying to get an understanding what your future life is going to look like. In a lot of the work that we do, we're trying to paint a picture to the courts of what that's going to look like. So you want to be putting estimated expenses in. How much is the new place you're going to rent? How much is that going to cost? What is it going to cost you to get kids back and forth from school, or put them in daycare, or the new healthcare costs that you're going to have that are going to be in front of you here? What does that look like? And that's how we want to paint a picture to the courts of. And when we start going through negotiations, we want to be make sure you can maximize the amount of support that you're going to get by making sure that you sit down and put in a plan in place around what your estimated expenses are. So it's amazing that you went through that exercise.
Yeah. And I did it for myself and my ex-husband, if you could believe that. So I, in our relationship, managed all the finances. I paid all the bills. I kept the spreadsheets. I did all of that. And so when we had that discussion, in DC, because we didn't have any children, the rule was you had to be living separately for 6 months before you can go to court. So that was sort of our primary, let's find separate places when our lease is up. And I started looking at apartments. And interestingly enough, he ended up moving into one of the apartments that I toured, because he had no concept of what his personal buying power was based on his salary at the time. So I had reforecasted all of my budget, like, hey, this is how much net I bring in. Here's all the expenses that I have. Here's about the estimate range I think I can afford in terms of what new rent would be with, utilities and all of these other costs coming my way. So I had a very solid understanding of what I was looking for from a rent payment perspective for my next place. And he was out there looking at very similar priced places, which I, had to politely say, you don't make nearly as much money as I do. And you are also taking on, this debt. Maybe you're not, we only had one car. It was mine. I brought it into the marriage. So, he was, didn't have a lot of that. But I had to do that forecast for him. I built the budget for him and said, based on how much you take home every month, here's what you can afford. And had to hand him the apartment and say, you don't want to move out of the area. This is probably your only option. And so, yeah, it was a fun experience to be like, good luck. I hope you know how to use spreadsheets.
Yeah, that's crazy. So you were effectively the CFO of the family.
Yep.
Okay. So just coming back to my earlier thoughts about that perceived sense of failure, any additional thoughts or any words of advice for listeners around that and how they can, because you work with, you've interviewed CEOs and you've interviewed some heavy hitters on your podcast that talk about their rise from the ashes, so to speak. So if the listeners out there were your clients, what would some of your advice be to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look back on it, right, I'm so thankful to my past self for choosing myself. And yes, 2019 was a really crappy year for me, and sort of rebuilding that life and having to go through that was not enjoyable. But if I would have stayed in that situation 5 years later, my life would look nothing like it is today. And I probably would be a lot worse off and a lot less happy. And I think as long as you are able to pull lessons or sort of make the pivot out of your failure and right yourself towards the path that you truly want to be on, then, you have to be thankful for those lessons, right? I, very early in my life, married the wrong person, but I got it together. I figured out who I was and what was more important to me. And the right person walked into my life like a month later. And it was not, I was not looking to meet anybody. We met on Tinder, so it was not supposed to be a serious thing, right? But that's just kind of how life goes. And I had that sort of internal, struggle with myself when I met my current husband. I just say like, no, like beat it, bro. I'm not looking to like date anybody. I'm like still technically married. But I think going through the divorce and going through and being in a relationship that was not right for me really highlighted to me the right person. When he showed up, I knew, he was the right person for me. And he always asks that too. He's like, how do you know? And I'm like, trust me, I've been through it. I know you are my person. I know what's important to me. And I know that this is going to be a long-term partnership together.
When you were going through this experience yourself, I'm going to venture, you have all these tools and resources that you've used that you've either developed, through the lessons learned and so on. What role did your personal network, your family and friends, like what role did those types of people play in your rise from the ashes, so to speak?
Yeah. So I'm a fairly independent person, which I don't know if my parents really intended to raise me that way, but they did. So at 18, I kind of left and they're wonderful. But yeah, very much an independent kind of person living my own life. So I kind of informed my parents when we were going through it. I was like, hey, we're getting divorced, and just kind of moved on. And they kind of left me alone because they understood, like, if she needs something, she'll come ask. I think going back to what we were talking about before, like the community that really got me through was at the time, like my CrossFit gym and my CrossFit friends, because that was who I was seeing, on a daily basis, working out together, hanging out together, going out together. They were some of the first people who came over to have dinner with me at my new place, like the first night that, I was sort of alone, if you will. So I think it's just really nice to have that group of mostly really strong women around who really supported and was doing, very similar things or had been in similar experiences, to just be like, hey, we get it. We've been there. And I think it's funny when you get divorced, you understand that when someone comes up to you afterwards and like, oh, I'm really sorry. But the people who've been divorced, you're like, good for you. Congratulations. So it's funny to see that cohort of people. And I've been able to have some cool conversations with people in my life, past and present, who are going through similar situations, because I try to be very open about it. Like, yeah, it sucks, but you have to prioritize yourself and your future self. So get through this like rough patch and choose yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah. Tell me more about the podcast and your future like vision for the podcast and for the listeners that haven't had a chance to check it out just yet, maybe a little bit more about the context and some of the people that you've interviewed so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mastering the Art of Failing is really, we don't have an industry that we target. We mostly have talked to, I think, a lot of entrepreneurs, but we've had, veterans, authors, business school professors, just people all across the board coming on to sort of talk about their vision for their life, right? Like I said, I thought I was going to end up in politics, and that is not where we are. So sort of where they thought younger in their career they would be, their journey through, and then like that critical failure or pivot moment where they're like, I hate this, or this is not going well, or like this is, out the door. And the lessons that they learned from that, and then sort of where they are today and where they are, how they've been successful. And so it's a cool way to take a spin on it. And, from my perspective, that is always a conversation that I've kind of shied away from. But where the genesis came from, as I said before, was, my co-host and I stood up a business probably a decade ago when we were very young. We had no experience, no business sort of doing these things, but we had really grand plans. And it was a ton of fun while we were doing it. But looking back, we had that discussion, sort of our pilot episode. It was like, man, if we only did this today, right? Like how much more would we have known and how much more successful could we have been? We probably would have actually accomplished what we set out to do. But it's just holding those situations in your life where they're like, they were so fun. They were a huge success at the time. Did I accomplish my goal? No, but it put me on a trajectory to be where I am today. And I'm so thankful for that and the network that I built and all the time that we spent together. So it's been really fun to talk to people about that and sort of put a positive spin on, failure, if you will, but really the moments of clarity, I think, and pivot points that people have had throughout their life.
Yeah, that's the impetus for this conversation too, right? It's trying to help as many people as we can and help them get unstuck effectively, right?
Yeah, absolutely. People get so comfortable and so stuck in these situations, and that's, I think, probably the number one thing that I've heard from, friends and colleagues who've been in similar situations with relationships is they get stale, but it's so comfortable and you just don't know what's on the other side of it. And, I've had other colleagues who, I can't afford to do this. My spouse is the breadwinner. I'm not sure. But again, I think, you have to bet on yourself at the end of the day and be willing to take that leap and put yourself in the best possible situation in the future.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better myself. Amazing, amazing words of advice there. This is the carte blanche section or part of our session today. So I don't have any specific question for you other than, is there anything that any questions I didn't ask that I should have, or is there anything that you want to share with our listeners, personal experience, professional experience, whatever it is, that you think they need to hear as we wrap up our show here?
Yeah. I wish I would have thought about it a little sooner, I think. And I think you have that in the back of your mind when you're in a situation, whether it's a relationship or a job or what have you, where it's just like not clicking, right? It's like not exactly. And I will tell you, people don't change. The situation doesn't change, right? You're never you can do X, Y, and Z, and they're not going to change. It's not going to get better. And so I wish that I had kind of pulled that trigger a little bit earlier and said, maybe we didn't even get married, like that would have been best case scenario. But at the end of the day, and my husband and I now talk about this a lot, we probably wouldn't have gotten along earlier or met even earlier in life, right? So as much as I wish that I could have prevented myself from going through that in my 20s, meeting him in my 30s was probably the place and the time that I needed to meet him. So, the universe brings you what you need when you need it.
Oh, yes. Amen. Amen. That's for sure. I probably should have ripped the Band-Aid off, years prior, but I was stuck. I could have used your help 10 years ago, but
and it's so easy to say these things, right? Like it's so hard to do. And trust me, I had to have many pep talk conversations with myself about what are you doing? This is insane. But yeah, easier said than done. But being the person who actually did both of us rip off the Band-Aid at some point, right? We got there. Totally worth it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you, Alex, for joining us today and sharing such valuable perspectives. For those of you listening, if you want to learn more about embracing failures and transforming them into opportunities for future growth, you have got to check out this podcast at failingpod.com. Alex kills it. I think she has some amazing episodes up. So check out failingpod.com. And remember, if you're navigating the complexities of divorce, my team and I here at Allegiant Divorce Solutions are here to help. You can always visit us at allegiantds.com for more support and free resources, or to book a call with us to talk through your specific situation. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more insightful conversations with folks just like Alex that are coming your way here really soon. Until next time, embrace the journey and the lessons that it brings. I think that's the main message here. So everybody have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon.